But first up, let's talk about the week, which was interesting, isn't it? A real kerfuffle about the reshuffle. And understandably so, because one of the government's great performers, Matt Canavan, has been left on the backbench, where he's now saying he'll say and do whatever it is he feels he should. Well, I don't think he's been anything else but since he's been there. And Canavan is one of those real stand-up, capable guys that you want to see actually in the cabinet room where the day-to-day decisions of government are taken. So we'll see how that plays out. Likewise, Barnaby Joyce and others have been uttering that they will use their vote judiciously on the floor of Parliament and aren't guaranteed to always pass the government's legislation. Well, nothing much has changed. I go back to when Barnaby came into the party room in 2004. He was exactly the same way, and I had one of my ministerial colleagues whose wife said, Barnaby is as old as my eldest son, and I think I'd lay him across my lap and give him a smack on the hindquarters if he doesn't actually do the right thing by the government. I think Barnaby Joyce will. And I think the Prime Minister was right today to say that members of Parliament are, in their own ways, leaders of their community and are always going to be judicious in the way they go about their business of deciding what to pass and whatever. And, of course, the great influence is in the party room forums and so forth. So it's going to be interesting to watch. The thing I like about where Canavan and Joyce are is that each stand up loud and proud for regional and remote Australia. And I would like to believe that water, being the #1 issue in this country, will now start to see the real light of day. And I actually am not even worried at all if Canavan and Joyce and others who want to jump on board hold their vote up from Scott Morrison and say, you know what, until you do something about waterproofing this country, until you do something about building some dams, until you actually do something about amending federal legislation that prevents these dams from being built by state governments, you can't be guaranteed I'm going to vote for you on things. I mean, that's the horse trading that the minor parties do. Then the bloke who's gone into the cabinet, Keith Pitt, I've got a lot of time for him, and Keith Pitt is now the Minister for Water. Why on earth water is a hot potato is beyond me, and David Littleproud, who I think is terrific. I know some people don't like him, but I think David Littleproud is terrific, and I hope I haven't killed his career by saying it. But Littleproud has gone back to agriculture, and fair enough too. He's still looking after emergency services. He did a great job during the summer period. Now Keith Pitt, who is an adventurous bloke, who's no fool. He's not from North Queensland, he's from Bundaberg. It's 4 hours drive from Brisbane. North Queensland really doesn't start to hit about 18 hours north of Brisbane. But Keith Pitt is from Bundaberg, born and bred, and he knows stuff about things. He stood up for nuclear power, but of course you can't have nuclear power, you can't have any form of power if you don't have a proper water supply. And he's now the Minister for Water. And of course Keith Pitt, the other problem or real interest that Keith Pitt will have is that he has a dam in his electorate called Paradise Dam, which it's almost a criminal act by the Queensland government. They're going to pull the dam down. The water's going to go out to sea in the middle of a drought, all because the dam's been incompetently built. And Keith Pitt knows all about that. The Queensland government have passed legislation to give them the coverall they need for what I think is economic vandalism. So I'm pretty excited about Keith Pitt being there. I'm disappointed about Matt Canavan not being there, but time will tell and see what the Sir Humphreys do to the innovative bloke, which is Keith Pitt. The Prime Minister called him a performer today. I believe he is too. Let's see and hope that he does all the right things. The other big issue, of course, this week is the coronavirus. Now, this thing has been cooked up, it's pretty evident, cooked up by some mad scientists in China. I don't care what anyone says. China has got to account for how this thing has now infected tens of thousands of people so darn quickly. Last week there were reports around about five-figure numbers, 10, 12,000 being reported bravely of people who'd actually died from it. Now, they're constantly ramping up the number of people who have died, but it is now reported widely, including the Daily Mail, UK Daily Mail, that it is now in the tens of thousands who have been infected. Now, this coronavirus is a shocking thing, but it's not all that new. As I understand it, Dettol kills coronavirus stone dead. In other words, it's something that is passed around by people touching each other, touching and holding hands, touching and shaking hands, wiping your nose, and that puts it up into the nasal passage and you sneeze it over people. That's how this thing is spread. And I'm not a doctor, but I think it's pretty simple to say that let's look at why this thing has spread and so rampantly in places like China, in places like cruise ships. It's all about the cleanliness. I mean, you've got a country where night markets and food being served next to drains is part of their everyday thing. It's not unreasonable to assess why this stuff has been spread. But health practitioners here in Australia are trying to do the right things about this. They're very frustrated, many of them. Very frustrated because they can't get hold of things like face masks, and they've sold out. We've seen prices as high as $399 for a box of 10 and 20. There are people who are now profiteering off the back of this coronavirus misery that's being inflicted upon people who have travelled on planes, who've been in close quarters with others, who've touched things. You've seen Qantas cleaners who've said, I don't want to necessarily clean flights out of China because of the way in which some of the things I clean up have been treated. You can understand all of this. But media are feeding a lot of hysteria, so much so as it's starting to damage our economy. Parts of Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, no doubt Hobart and Perth. And I can attest, because I live in a part of Brisbane where there's a lot of people who've got Chinese heritage, and they're incredibly frustrated. Functions are being cancelled, events are not occurring, restaurants are completely empty, food prices on things like seafood going down as the market is responding to the fact that people aren't buying. Hell, you can get a car park in Sunnybank. I mean, it is just amazing. I'm sure the same thing is true around Earlwood and Box Hill and Epping and other places around Australia. But we are very, very prone here in Australia, not just to coronavirus, but to external influences to damage our economy. And the simple reason is why. I'll go back to where I started tonight, where I have often been over the last couple of years on this program. And that is that we have no real vision for where our country is going to be 10 and 20 and 30 years from now. We have no real ambition or passion to drive difference to build our economy. It's all about managing our decline. It's all about, oh, well, we'll try and get ourselves into a surplus and all these things. They're all admirable and all good indicators. But our country and our economy is incredibly prone because we've done nothing about imagining what Australia needs as far as its water supply is concerned. Yet it all comes back to water. Our tourism industry is damaged. So many communities are being damaged. Our economy in the cities are being damaged, and I've got no doubt that people tonight in inner city Sydney and inner city Melbourne will be saying, well, look, you know, it's rained in Newtown today in Sydney, so therefore the drought must be over. It ain't over. It ain't over. And we'll talk a lot about that tonight, and we'll talk about it until somebody does something. Are you listening, Barnaby? Until somebody does something. Are you listening, Matthew? I'm sure they are. And I know Keith Pitt and Scott Morrison would be listening as well.